Okay, feel free to start whenever.
Cool, thanks. I was literally just jamming out to the elevator music. Thanks everyone for waiting. Right. So yeah, well, we're going to get started. So this is the Tips for Writing Compelling TF Stories panel. Yeah, just want to say thanks to all the organisers of this con. It's been great so far, and yeah, thanks for putting all this together. And yeah, the panel earlier was awesome as well, and we were looking through the questions that came through with that, with the writers panel. And yeah, there's a lot of questions like how to get started writing, yeah, tips and tricks of how to write itself. So we're hoping we can cover some of that now. And the plans we got is to run through a load of slides just to talk about the subject a little bit, and then get through that as quickly as possible to open up for as many questions as we can at the end. So let's get this moving. Awesome. So yeah, we're going to look over characterization, dialogue, world building, editing, story construction, and then going on to sort of how to upload stories online and some tips for that. Yeah, well, the plan is, yeah, save your questions to the end. We're not going to have time to sort of answer them as we go along. So yeah, to start off, hi, I'm Zen. I'm a coyote. I write on FA. I've been there for about 4 years-ish, so I've been writing a lot of fan fiction for a lot longer. And my specialisms is kind of writing TF merging wholesome and kinky themes together, I guess. And yeah, I'll pass over to Marquis.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Marquis Orias, everybody's favorite quote-unquote extinct marsupial. I've been writing for about 4 years now, and primarily I focus on stories that tend to be very dialogue-heavy and emphasize a lot of world building. If you've read some of my work before, you know that the stories can tend to get a little bit on the longer side, but that's just how I operate. So I'll be taking it further then into our first set of slides. And we'll be starting with general characterization. And as I mentioned before, dialogue, kind of my bread and butter. So we're going to go right into that. But in terms of compelling dialogue, that's something that comes up a lot with writing in general, and not just transformation stories. But people wonder how to actually write conversations that feel real. You know, how do you write character dialogue that's engaging but also feels genuine, feels authentic? And the trick is, I think, actually to let real dialogue sort of, or to let your written dialogue mirror real dialogue, in that it stumbles. You know, real dialogue has moments of pause. It has errors. People, make mistakes when they speak. And, you can use italics and bolding as well for word emphasis, stylistically in an actual written dialogue, as you're trying to capture that essence, I would say, of real dialogue for emphasis. There's also the use of slang or deliberate misuse of words. People, again, to reiterate back to my earlier point, people are not perfect when they talk. There's lots of mistakes, there's lots of stumbling, people take pauses, people sometimes say too much or they say too little. There's a back and forth with dialogue to really capture the true essence of what makes it more authentic. And I think that's something to keep in mind when you're writing character dialogue in any story, not just a transformation story, but in any story. You want to just keep that in mind for how you're structuring your dialogue. Typically as well, you want to also avoid exposition overload, and you want to let details come out naturally through the course of a common conversation. Generally, people do not info dump, but in some instances they actually do. So it generally depends on the setting of the story you're writing and whether or not, how you want to carry across that exposition, I would say. In terms of cases where info dumping makes sense, well, if you have a character that's being introduced to a new job, or they're in a situation for the first time and it's all new to them and somebody else is showing them the ropes or explaining something, then you can have more of an exposition overload, so to speak. But in a normal conversation, you generally wouldn't have that. And the importance of maintaining both that sense of real dialogue and also avoiding an exposition overload is that you want to maintain the importance of mood, which is my next slide to my next point, which is, For capturing those dramatic, comedic, or horrifying moments, dialogue provides a glimpse, into how a character processes a situation externally beyond just their thoughts and their actions. And all those together are the trifecta, I would say, of characterization. Their internal monologue, their external voice, as well as their actions. And you want to generally approach all three of those simultaneously to generate a compelling narrative, because dialogue, it could conflict with their inner thoughts. You're providing a compelling narrative, or you're providing a situation where a character might say something but think something differently, and you're doing that juxtaposition, especially within the context of a transformation story, that really can sell the impact of mental changes or how they feel about the situation that they're being put through. And also, dialogue can break up descriptive revelations rather than merely providing them. It can assist with pacing and give readers time to process what they just read, and that's more in line with story structure itself. But I think dialogue is something to really keep in mind if you're getting overly descriptive with certain paragraphs, to have a break for characters to stop and really just talk, rather than you as the writer, when you're setting up your exposition or you're writing just descriptive paragraphs. Now, going beyond that, we also have narrative consistency, and I think that also ties into characterization as well as and also tonal whiplash. So narrative consistency is safe. Narrative consistency is normal. What I mean by that is generally the tone of a piece. If you're writing a comedy, it stays a comedy throughout. If you're writing something that's more intense, it stays intense throughout. If you're writing something that's more horrific, then it's a horror story from start to finish. Tone shifting is when you pivot it from one to another. So there is value in that if you want to add some levity to a piece that is intended as a horror piece, and you want to add in something that's more along the lines of a joke or something comedic. You can do that to break up some of the intensity, and that is also I think it's something very valuable to do as well, to give the reader time to break and also time to process what they've read, and then the impact of the more serious moments are made even greater by that balance. Now, there's risks involved with that too. If you do tone shifting too quickly, it can become too jarring. It can take a reader out of a piece. I would say, what really derails it is if you're having a story that's supposedly just mainly a comedy, but you pivot it from being just a comedy into something more horror related or more serious, and there's no real ramp up to that. That can be jarring for a reader. So it's generally good to have more of a balanced journey, especially if you're pivoting from one tone to another. But at the end of the day, narrative style is ultimately your choice as a writer. And I would say, what I'm saying here is just some of my opinions, and at the end of the day, you have to kind of make your own choices based upon the story that you want to tell, the story that you want to write. So take what I'm saying more or less with a grain of salt. It's just some of what I've experienced, what I've seen over my years of writing. In terms of tone shifting and dialogue and how that fits into character consistency, I want to pivot back a little bit to that earlier mention of how you can have a contrast between a character's internal monologue and their external voice. And I think that in a TF story can really drive home the impact of a mental or personality shift. Generally, in a traditional story, a character's internalized transformational journey is generally more gradual. But in a transformation story, and especially a more short form one, you have the opportunity to approach a mental change, at a rapid pace, and really work with, how the character is externally vocalizing their changes versus how they're processing it mentally. And that back and forth between that internal voice and that external voice, I think, is very powerful for conveying mental changes in a TF. And then you also have the ability to use character inconsistencies, a character acting out of character through their thoughts or through their words, to also drive home that point that the extent of the transformation of what they are becoming. So those are the slides that I had for characterization. A variety, I would say. There's different approaches to it. I'm definitely more dialogue heavy in how I construct my work. But I want to pivot now to world building specifically. Now, world building generally has it can be a trap in a sense, because it's very easy to get carried away with constructing a realm or constructing rules for your world, or building your setting without actually writing the narrative itself. And I think that it's better to handle world building more so just early on with simpler rules, and you can let it grow slowly over time as you build your piece. I would say typically the more drastic or unusual a world building rule is, the earlier you should establish it, or at least hint at it when you're writing a story. As well as any setting constraints, once you establish them, those constraints should be heeded by the characters, who generally should be aware of it. If a world has always been this way, though that's also something that's something fun to work with in reality shift pieces, where a character knows the world used to be different, and they have to sort of figure out the rules of their new environment. That can be very fun as well. But typically, you set your own rules in the world that you've constructed, and you can carry them out however you want. Just generally, it's better to provide them earlier rather than later, so that you don't surprise people with just things that come out of nowhere. If certain magical abilities are brought into the equation, it's better to establish that earlier, because it could be jarring or surprising to the reader if it comes out of nowhere. Just the benefits of establishing rules and a little bit of foreshadowing. So the next slide that I have to talk to about world building is tropes. So tropes are generally common or overused themes, sometimes referred to as cliches. I actually think within the confines of TF stories, tropes are your friends, because you can use them as sort of they're building blocks in a way. They're foundational to creating a piece, and they exist for a reason, because people generally tend to like them, and you can subvert some. You go inverse a trope in certain instances to rebalance your narrative as well. But at the same time, if you have something, your building blocks, if you subvert those building blocks too much, it can really ruin the impact of the piece that you're trying to say. Generally, this varies. It's based upon the type of story that you're trying to tell, and however you want to convey those story beats. Again, you have a lot of flexibility. Tropes are building blocks. You can work with them kind of however you see fit. But it's just important to not subvert tropes, I would say, just for the sake of subversion, if you're writing a transformation piece, because then you can take away the elements of a transformation piece that people and the reader like, and that can be shocking, sometimes in a good way or sometimes in a bad way. I'm not saying to not do it at all, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're trying to balance out a story narratively, especially within the confines of world building. It's fine to keep certain cliches and to inverse or do the opposite of other ones. Beyond that, the perils of over-explanation. If you've written kind of a longer form piece, there can be temptation to try to explain every little piece of your world, every little thing that you've constructed. And that's also part of the trap of world building, in that you can get bogged down in the fine details. It's okay to not explain everything. Even throughout the course of an entire novel, you don't have to explain everything. You can trust your reader to fill in the gaps using the context that you've provided. And you clarify and explain certain things only to the comfort level that fits your vision, I would say, as a writer. It's okay sometimes to be vague. And if people are fascinated by the world and want to know more, that's a solid indicator that you have an audience for a sequel, or they're going to request more information. And then you, as the creator, you can provide that information to them, or you could write more pieces. You could flesh out a shared universe, or write sequels, and that gives you the opportunity to slowly and gradually get to that point of total explanation, as opposed to saying too much in your original work and just getting bogged down in exposition, getting bogged down in details, and not actually advancing the overarching plot. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next slide is on editing. So editing is your friend. Editing can also be done by your friends. Know when to accept and reject criticism. Generally, any sort of spelling or grammar corrections are totally fine. But I would say the one thing to keep in mind is to not let editors change the overall meaning of your work unless you also agree with those changes. If you agree with the changes that have been suggested by a beta reader, then that's fine. Additionally, if you're editing yourself and you just have you're just editing on your own, then rereading a story aloud I find is very helpful for catching inconsistencies and mistakes. And it's perfectly all right to also reread older stories, identify any grammar issues or misused words, and then correct or re-upload that story as necessary. Something doesn't always have to be static as it's published. If you find small mistakes. But if you do that, it's always better to just re-upload said file in place of the original, not to totally repost it. And then also, a word of advice is to not re-upload older stories with major plot changes or additions. Don't George Lucas your TF stories. It'll irritate your readers. Better to just write something new if you're going to make major changes. So editing and world building. So how do those two tie together? And I would say it's more connected than you'd think, because the editing phase, when you've created a TF story, you've created a specific piece, is where you're going to comb through the lore you've crafted so far to ensure that it stays relatively consistent. It's where you can retroactively add little breadcrumbs here or there to foreshadow later plot events, maybe that you missed earlier, and it lets you tie a piece more tightly together so that the reader has a better experience when they go through the entire thing. And I would say that the longer and more complex the piece, the greater the importance of lore-specific editing becomes. So you really want to be aware of, if you're writing a full novel, that you've maintained some degree of consistency in your overarching lore. So just a few tidbits. Managed to get through those slides fairly quickly. I know it can be a little dry, but I'll also jump back in at the end for the Q&A session. And in the time being, I'm just going to mute myself and turn it over to Zen.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Sorry I was a bit late on some of the slides there. I was getting distracted by stuff in chat. Awesome. So yeah, we're going to talk about story construction and sort of how I approach writing at quite a technical level, I guess. So for me, storytelling is construction. So I think of words like you might think of Lego bricks. So if you're building some big Lego model and piece by piece, for me, writing is how I join words into a sentence, then a sentence into a paragraph, and then multiple paragraphs into a story. So I wanted to kind of cover that thinking today and sort of cover these three main points, which is structure, pacing, and formatting. And for me, writing's, it's like building a house. You need really good foundations. And these are some quite foundational things, which I think are really important. And then you can start adding the bells and whistles on top. And like Marquis was saying earlier, I'm just going to sort of discuss ideas. This isn't like constraints. I'm not setting this as how you have to do something. It's kind of just leveling the playing field and saying, here's what exists, and have fun and be creative with it all. So yeah, with structure, story structure, what we mean is effectively the sequence of events. So stories have a start, a middle, and an end, generally speaking. For transformation, we have the benefit that something is changing. So we can generally consider stories in the sense of what's pre-TF, the higgledy-piggledy in the middle of the TF itself, and then what happens afterwards, the post-TF. And this can automatically be a good way of structuring stories into that start, middle, and end. What's really important is to plan what information the reader needs to know and when. Like Marky was saying earlier, it's really important that you try and think ahead to what things people need to know for world building. That might be right at the start, setting out the introduction, what people need to know. But it might be some kind of mystery story, and actually you want to give all those details right at the end as a surprise. So having that in advance and knowing when you're going to introduce those facts is really important. So this is a very classic story structure pyramid that is very satisfying. This is if you read something like I think it's Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces, a lot of stories sort of boil down to the same events. And so readers sort of getting into a story and seeing this type of structure is automatically quite satisfying. And it follows this structure where you start with exposition, so that's sort of the introduction, what's happening. It could be a person working in a lab and they have a test tube full of gooey black substance. And then the inciting incident is generally for us, for transformation people, that's the TF trigger. That's the thing that makes something happen. So you spill the test tube, you get the goo on you, and then the transformation starts. So the rising action, climax, falling action is generally it going into the transformation. So as things are changing, the climax might be, this is the final transformation, or it might be for adult stories, events afterwards. And then it goes into some kind of resolution. What's happened? How are the characters feeling now? What's the post-TF? What's the state of the world after everything that's happened? And pacing. So anyone who's got critique from me, I always go into pacing. It's kind of my thing. So this is the speed at which a story is told, not necessarily the speed of events. So you could write an 8,000 word story going into minute detail of every anatomy change of a dog transformation, when in real life the transformation might only take 5 minutes. That's the type of thing. So pacing really defines the mood of the story. So if you have long, bulky sentences and long paragraphs going into lots of detail, it kind of muddies the story and drags it out and slows down the pace. But then if you have lots of short, snappy, intermingled sentences, it makes fast-paced action. So you can sort of define the mood and the feeling of the story, not so much on the content, but literally just how you're telling the content and how you're writing it within the very structure of the sentences. And something that fits into this quite nicely is both showing and telling. So these two are kind of equal, not one is better than the other. We think of showing as kind of using description and action to experience the story. So that might be in the dog TF, I can feel my nose getting wet, I can feel the whiskers growing out, my nails are pushing out into claws, that type of thing. You're really getting into the details of it all. And I kind of think of it like a camera zoomed right in on those details. And then telling would be the opposite. That's when you zoom right out and you just say to the reader almost directly, James is turning into a dog, full stop. So being able to sort of alternate that from the descriptions and the showing into that telling can add a lot of emphasis into the story by just literally like how I think of it, like a camera zooming out and just sort of hammering out those details can be really effective. And last but not least, for these little three, formatting. So how your story looks will influence how people read it. So first and foremost, make your story readable, make it clear, make it legible. You want people to be able to read it and read it, literally. But also be artistic and expressive within that. So, for example, if you're writing a slow burn TF and it's, again, like a lab setting and each page is a different entry into like a lab book diary, you can sort of format each page to look like that. You could have like detailed descriptions, and then the narrative itself, you might want to use a font, which is kind of like handwriting maybe. So you can almost set the scene just within how the text looks. Indentations and justifications, you can go for quite a formal, like it's a formal typesetting like you would expect in a typical book, or you go for something more playful. So things like different colored text. If there's a wolf TF and it goes ooh and howls at the end, you could put that in a different text to sort of highlight those changes. So yeah, be playful, but always remember you need to make sure that people are able to read it at the end of the day. Great. So I never know where to put this in, so I just dropped it in here. This is a piece of text by Gary Provost. I have no idea who they are and where this comes from, but I love this screenshot and I always share it with people. And this is about varying sentence length and how that can really change sort of how a story reads. And again, this isn't necessarily the absolute content. This is literally just how the sentence is arranged and structured. So it starts off with just 5-word sentences, one after another. It's very monotonous. It muddies the story. And then it cuts to the second paragraph. It says, now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Full stop. Music, the writing sings, has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences, etc., etc. So again, like Marquis was saying earlier about reading stuff out loud, it automatically highlights the music to your writing. And if you want to sort of alleviate that almost roboticness to your writing, this sort of mechanical style to it, have a look at how you're varying your sentences and your sentence structures and how you can vary between those detail-orientated, sort of monotonous sections and then zooming the camera lens out into those short, snappy, very sort of telling the reader what's happening. And it can really add to sort of the compellingness of your story. So yeah, some housekeeping about uploading online. My background for the sort of fairy TF writing's all been on Fair Affinities, so my bias is towards that. I will try and generalize this as much as I can for all those other types of websites, etc. But the thing to consider is sort of the expectations of the reader or the takeaway they're going to get from the story versus your goals as a writer. So in this sense, the reader could just be you. You've written a story and you read it again yourself later, or it could be anyone online, friends, whoever. But they should understand or know roughly what the story is and what they're expecting to get out of it. So things readers are going to want to know, effectively how long the story is. Is this a 2,000 word story they can read quickly in half an hour? Or is this a 100,000 word story they're going to take a week to read? What the narrative is. Is it sort of first and third person, which are kind of normal, kind of expected, I guess, within a lot of writing? Or is it in second person, which some people love, some people hate? So that can kind of be a turn off or a turn on. People might see a second person story and be like, no, that's not for me. Or they might see it and be like, yes, I love second person. I need to read this. And the same goes for content warnings. And I kind of mingle in tags a little bit with that. So it's always good to have on your story some content triggers, I guess. And that might be things like, oh, it's got horror or violence or stuff, which might be, again, turn offs to warn people what's not in your story. So warn you what is in your story. Or it might be things like, I don't know, hypno or inanimate or stuff, which, again, for some people might not like, but some people might be searching through looking specifically for that stuff, and you're flagging the main themes of your story for them. So content warnings, they're not things to scare people away from your stories. This is just how we manage the community. We want to make sure we're respectful of people's different tastes and stuff. So I'm putting that out there as a really great way of creating this collaborative environment. And plot points and thematics, that's just kind of the blurb. So as you pick up a book and read the back, what's roughly in it, you're not spoiling the story. You're not telling them literally what happens ABC, but you're giving them a rough overview. What's the genre? What's the mood of the story? What type of characters in it? What's the style of the TF? So like you watch a trailer for a movie, what's the type of things that are going to be in the story? So yeah, so when you come to post online, a good title that's grabbing is really good. Provide some kind of story blurb or summary in your upload, just again to highlight those things which are in it. So those content warnings or tags, triggers, etc., as well as a few sentences just saying, what's the genre, who's in it, what's it about? So people can know, oh, actually, this type of story is for me, I should read it. Relevant icons really good, especially for websites which are primarily designed around sort of art galleries. So I just chucked an example here of mine which shows those key things, grabby title, some just bullet points of themes, and then word count, narrative. Post in accessible formats, PDFs a good one, text, things like that, and consistent tagging. I'm not going to go into it today, but there's something I'm quite passionate about. But try and match what the community uses. People are going to be looking for the type of tags that they use themselves. So go through other people's galleries, see what types of tags they're using, and work with what the community has. So the final thing I just wanted to say before we move on to all the questions is the best way to learn how to write is to read. Read people's stories and whatever fiction inside the community or outside. The more you read, the more you sort of understand how people do things and how they structure their story, how they breach certain topics and stuff like that. Don't copy it, don't replicate it exactly, but let it inspire you and try out sort of matching different styles or sort of replicating roughly how people approach different subjects and see if you can do that yourself. Like an artist might sort of get inspiration tips from other artists, it's very similar for writing. And if you are in the community and you see stories you like, comment on them, let people know. It's really important that we get that community spirit going. So I will leave this up for a little while for questions, and I think I'll just pass it straight to Marquis to take the first ones.
Sure. So for questions, I think the best way to go about it is that you could just ask questions in general to both of us. But if you want, Zen or myself to either answer a question specifically, just at us in the chat, and we'll address it accordingly.
Awesome.
But yeah, please feel free to ask as many questions as you want. We have about half an hour left that we dedicated just to questions, just to Q&A. Let me see. Suggestions for long form TF works, like suggestions in terms of recommendations of like what to read, or like tips for creating them. I'll go back to that one later.
Yeah.
Biggest rookie mistake you see in TF? Zen, what would you say? Because I have an idea, but I'll let you go first.
I think it's generally a focus on one thing at the expense of everything else. So you see stories where some people might just do mind change and they do it really, really well, but it just lacks all context of anything else. So you just kind of lose the sense of what's happening. And it's the same, some people just write all the physical stuff, which is great, but then you're kind of like, well, how do they feel? What's going on? You know, what's the character thinking? So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say, in my opinion, like the biggest rookie mistake I see in TF, but also generally in like basic writing, is very choppy sentence structure, where it's like just 4 or 5 words, very brief sentences, to the point that you had gone over in your slide about just the variety of sentence length and pacing. That to me stands out the biggest when I'm reading a TF story, is just if every sentence is the same length, if it starts with just the character's name, or if it starts with just a pronoun, then that can get very monotonous to read through, I would say. But that's not just in TF; that's in writing in general. I think that's very much a beginner writer trap.
Cool. So yeah, just say the slides. We'll share the slides and make sure they get around, so that won't be a problem. This question came up earlier and it's just come up again now. So about pauses, adding them to stories, especially with dialogue. So yeah, ellipses, those dots. I use them a lot. They're quite good. You can also be really sneaky. So if you have a sentence and you want to have a pause in the middle, so the dialogue starts, and then add text in between. So close the quotation, add your quotation marks, and write a bit of explanation. Oh, she hummed, or she thought, or whatever. And then add more of the dialogue at the end. So kind of split your dialogue in half. And so the pause is literally a pause because the reader is reading something else. So it can almost create the illusion of a pause without having to add all these ellipses in. Let's see, what else do we have?
Yeah, as far as pauses and ellipses go, I definitely overuse them. That's just stylistically how I write, though, and that's something I'm probably never going to change. That I'm always going to do that.
It's me with M dashes. They just go everywhere. They are my do-it-all tool. Okay, this is a good one. Tips for getting through writer's block. Do you want to go for that first, Marquis?
Yeah, tips for getting through writer's block. I handle it by always having multiple different stories going at the same time. So I'm an outline writer, so I generally structure a story when I have the full idea down of how I want to approach it. And because of that, I tend to also write out of order. So I will jump around between different stories, or I will jump around within a story specifically. If I hit a wall in a story for writer's block, I just try to pivot to something else. If it's really bad writer's block and I can't work on anything, then I switch over to reading. Because I think the best thing you can do is, if you can't write, then read a lot, because that will help generate, not only fresh ideas, but it'll kind of reset your own brain as you're thinking about the writing process, because you'll be processing different styles, different authors, and I think that's very valuable. Is that to handle writer's block, if you really can't write anything and you can't pivot to something else, then just read as much as you can.
Yeah. What I'd say, and I think this probably links to some other questions as well, when I sort of plan stories and design sort of what I'm going to write, I kind of go through the whole thing, and so I know roughly an outline of the type of thing I'm going to do. When I come to write itself, I almost always write the introduction first as the pre-TF, and then the conclusion post-TF. And then I fill in all the middle stuff in between. So if I can get the A and the B done, I can generally then connect the dots in the middle without suffering too much from writer's block. If I just start a story from the beginning, I always get confused. Where am I going to go next? But if I have that sort of final base that I know I have to reach, it's much easier for me to sort of see the path for how to get there. So I'm not sure if that's a proper way of how to write, but for me, especially with TF stories, it's always good to kind of do start, then end, and then think about how to connect them.
I see a question about how often or how long do I deliberate how to use POV in a given story. Generally, that's one of the first things that I'll decide when I'm writing a piece. I know pretty quickly if I'm writing it in first, second, or third person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like they define a lot of the styles, like depending on how you write the narrative, sort of the narrator of the story. With first and second person, you can write a lot of the sort of story structure as if the narrator doesn't actually know the facts for themselves because they're either I or they're you. So sometimes you can almost disguise the story within the story. But with third person, you'll often have a lot of the freedom of this all-knowing narrator who can just drop in the facts where they're needed.
Mhm.
Yeah, great question.
I'm kind of scrolling up and down the chat to see different ones.
Oh, there's an at here. What are some of the ways you show more subtle mental changes, especially in a longer and slower gradual TF story? Do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think with showing more subtle mental changes, I really try to get an internal dialogue going against like an external one. Maybe a character questions themselves, or they hesitate about certain actions. I think you really have to dive into that. If you really want to convey it, you can do it that way, or you can just do it through their actions slowly changing. If you're doing it purely externally, it would just be how their actions shift. I think you have some flexibility there with how you depict it. But for subtle, yeah, I think you with a longer story, you have a lot of time to work with, and I think you can just have them change small behaviors here or there, a little, very gradual, small behaviors, and that over time builds up until you really get to major mental changes, I would say.
Yes. I think something that's really difficult to do, but it's really cheeky if you pull it off, is like within the story itself, if you're just like describing events, like, oh, that thing is cool, that's like at the start of the story, change how the narrative uses different descriptions. So it might be awesome or badass at the end of the story because they've become some kind of jock. So how they see the world and describe the world has changed. So it's not even in like literally describing a different like attribute to the person or how they're thinking. It's just within the writing itself, changing the types of vocabulary that you use to more closely match sort of the person's mental or physical changes. But yeah, that's something definitely to do in editing. Don't try and do that as you're writing. Come back to that and think about how that will work when sort of the general gist of the story is there. Well,
Yeah, lots of questions.
we will try and get through as many as we can, and then if not, we'll come back to these. We can write our answers and stuff and post them with the slides, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Scrolling down. I've always been one who writes with the flow with no outline. What's your opinion on people who write like that? I have no opinion. That's absolutely fine. If whatever works, just stick with it. Outlines I find easier to work with because it's basically running through the story. It's like an artist does a sketch before doing the final render. You want to have a rough idea where everything is and what the composition is. It's the same with me for writing. I want to know roughly what's happening, where's it going to go, and that could just be a few sentences, or for people who work with me, I got to write a page or something summary. But sometimes it's just good to go freestyle. You've got a rough idea, you think you know what's going to happen, and just go for it. I think the difference there is if you're writing for yourself or if you're working with other people. If you're collaborating with others or doing commissions, you need to have some kind of outlines so everyone's on the same page. Excuse the pun, of what's going to happen.
I see one about specific challenges for first person, second person. Well, first person, the challenge is you're speaking kind of as yourself. That might be hard if you can't get into the headspace of a certain character or certain characterization. Especially if you're trying to write a first person story that isn't really based on somebody who acts like you do. That could be somewhat challenging, I would think. Second person, second person's like the contentious POV. People either really love it or really dislike it because it kind of forces behaviors onto the reader, and sometimes that's great, and sometimes it just immediately takes somebody out of a piece. So I think the risk in second person POV is writing almost too. It's almost writing too strongly, where you're fully taking over, and you're having the character in question say and do things that like most people wouldn't say or do. So it's not really relatable at that point in time. But I'd say a lot of writers execute second person POV perfectly fine. It can just be a challenge to find that balance. And I certainly had to find that balance with some of my earlier second person POV stories, because I definitely wrote them very strongly and gave the second person POV characters a lot of characterization that made it harder for people to actually identify and self-insert into those pieces.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that the more vague you can make second person, the more readable it will be for whoever. But like, you always need this suspension of disbelief. It's always going to be, you have to kind of accept that this is a bit silly in a sense.
Right, like I wouldn't do this, or I wouldn't do that.
Exactly. But you just have to go with it. So I feel with second POV stories, you either have to kind of start off with, okay, this is the ground rules. If you accept this, everything's going to be fine. This is the setting. This is who you are. This is what's going to happen. Or you need to kind of add in some humor. You need to add in a bit of a joke of, you're reading this, it's a bit silly, but we're going to go along with it anyway and have a good time.
Exactly.
But striking that balance, it's just going to take practice. You just have to do it a few times and just, see how it goes. Try a few different things until it works. This is a good question. Trying to write TFs with proprietary characters. So I feel like there's a challenge between writing your style and getting the dialogue patterns for pre-existing characters and making them feel accurate. It's difficult. I think this is where it sort of borders what's just fiction and what's fan fiction. And with some characters, you can pretty much get away with anything. If you're just writing a generic Pokemon, I don't think there's any canon specifically for how they behave. But if you're getting into detailed characters, which are the heroes or whatever of their own movies, you just have to do research. And something I often do with movie characters is just look up like their top quotes from the film or whatever, and just look through their dialogue and try and replicate some of that dialogue. Try and get inspiration from it, just how they talk and the types of words they use. Because if you use something like a third-person story, you can kind of get away with the narrative as whatever. But it's the dialogue, like Marquis was saying earlier with the slides, that's really important.
All right. think we have another 15 minutes or so, so you can just keep the questions coming.
I'm going through.
How can one make, what's that say? How can one make the times in between of a story? You can handle those, I would say, through like a diary style entry. If you're like trying to break out a long form TF story across weeks or months, it's okay to have breaks and time skips or even different chapters where you just specify the time that's jumped ahead. I've done that before. I think it's perfectly fine with that sort of diary style approach.
Yeah, it comes onto another question. Sorry, we missed this earlier. It's how can one make the time in between of a story that's either very long or slow burn actually interesting or worth covering? So yeah, just literally just a page break and moving on, that can kind of cover it. And you might want to summarize in the next section roughly what's happened. I kind of do this thing where I imagine it like you see in movies sometimes, like someone sat by a window, then it sort of zooms outside and the seasons change or cars go past, whatever, and then it comes back inside and time has passed. Finding some kind of metric that you can summarize is really good. So if it's the seasons changing, that's a very classic stereotypical one. But other things that you can kind of comment on about how time has passed. That might only take a few sentences. And again, with pacing, you want some nice, long, slow, muddied sentences to show and really slow down that pace. It almost creates like the illusion of a longer section when actually it might only be half a paragraph long.
I see. How do you get past your own self-criticisms when you're writing? I just keep moving forward. If I dwell too long on a piece, I tend to not reread a lot of my older work for that reason, because I know it's gonna. It's also a sign of improving, though. If you've improved as a writer and you reread some of your older work, like you will feel compelled maybe to fix certain things too. Like it, I don't know. I feel like to get away from this, from being too overly critical, you just kind of have to always keep moving forward and not dwell on the past.
Yeah.
What do you find to be effective ways to get a story in front of eyeballs and build a readership? Consistency,
Yes.
I would say. If you write relatively consistent and you post regularly, that audience will start to appear. Writing a variety of different types of stories will broaden your audience as well. I've still never quite cracked the social media marketing myself, so that's not really like, I'm still figuring that out, so I can't really speak to that. But yeah, just leveraging social media, knowing where to post stories, that sort of thing.
And tagging is so important, so people can find your stuff.
Tagging and also having like internal folders, that's more specific to FA. But
Yeah.
I found that having like stories sorted by themes or sorted by genres or sorted by POV or sorted by species, having those folders within your FA gallery that people can quickly look through to find similar stories you've written to something they may have liked helps out a ton.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this is a question for you. How do you like to make stories that are reactive to your audience, or do you incorporate requests with all the raffles you do? Question mark.
So for context, I don't do comms. I keep this purely as a hobby. I never take monetary payment for my work, but I do a lot of free story raffles where I just let people enter. And I find that I like them because it lets me get exposed to other people's ideas, while at the same time taking out the pressure of like delivering on something that's been paid for. Like I still want to do a good job when I'm writing a raffle story, but I just feel like there's much less stress to it as well. And reactive to your audience or incorporate requests. Sometimes, generally, like I won't write story requests that people just, if people say write this or write that, I will at least try to humor them and say, I've written something similar to this before, and I'll point them to maybe work that I've done that might satisfy them. But beyond that, I mostly either write for myself or I write for the raffles, or I write for friends. So
Awesome. So this has come through a few times about sort of nagging feeling of doubt or whatever, or getting over the past and just going for it. Whatever I say, it's going to be much easier to say than actually doing it. It's difficult just to, especially for the first time, just put stuff online or between friends or to whoever and sharing these things. So you don't ever just put yourself up for how am I going to word this? It's a really difficult one. Effectively, just have trust in yourself, and also don't look back at your stories in a sense that everything is about moving forwards, like Marquis said earlier, and everything is a creative process. And whatever level you are one step towards the future of your creative process. So some people might be on that very bottom step, just getting started, and that's very difficult. And each step only gets easier because you got used to what it's like taking those steps. So that first step's always going to be the hardest, and that's putting stuff out there. And the more you do it, the easier it will get in that sense. And just going for it. And the community that I found, especially on sort of FA and going to different Discord servers as well, has been really supportive. People are generally wanting to read other people's work.
People do read TF stories. Like TF stories do get a unique, I would say almost like a unique readership compared to like numbers wise compared to like some other genres of furry work. So like there is definitely demand for TF stories. So it's always worth your time to at least try. To put yourself out there and to explore the ideas you want to explore and to bring your creations to life, your ideas to life.
I think the ideas is the key point there. Like I read a lot of people's work, and how people write and how people structure things isn't necessarily amazing. And a lot of people I've read, they're not even writing in their primary first language. So like hats off to them. But it might be a bit clanky. It might not be perfect. There might be some spelling errors, but the ideas is what really interests and excites me. And that can come across. You don't need to be an amazing writer in order to jot down your ideas. This is what I think is going to happen. This is how they're going to feel it. And there's no one perfect way of writing a story. Every story is going to be different. Some are going to be better than others. And sometimes it's better not necessarily because of how you've written it, but just because the core concept is there. So there can be some really unique things out there that just you wouldn't find otherwise.
Yeah. And you just have to be brave enough to sit down and create it yourself sometimes and put it out there for people to enjoy. And it is a good community, and you will find more support, I think, than you would think. It's you just have to take that leap.
And be that support for others as well. Like if you're seeing stories and it's not like got a few favorites and no comments, and you enjoy it, just leave a comment or a favorite. Share the love.
All right, so I think we're running up on time, but there were a lot more questions. I think we'll both try to go through the question list after the fact and just type up quick responses. Maybe post that along with the PowerPoint slides.
I will check with admin where the slides are going to go, and I'll make sure that people who want them will get them.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in and watching. I hope there were some valuable insights to take away from this, and we'll both be around creating. So we're not going anywhere.
We'll be around for sure. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.